Good afternoon. So if we Google Dr. HORSTMANN polio, we get some results. It says Dr. HORSTMANN made medical history by showing that the polio virus enters the bloodstream. She was an epidemiologist, virologist, clinician, and educator. There's another EDU website. Groundbreaking research on polio set the stage for the creation of the first polio vaccine. From Yale, it says, working in a Yale laboratory in the 40s, solved the puzzle. Let's ask Google what the doctor did. So if we Google the isolation of poliomyelitis virus, also add to the search for virus in the blood of patients, National Institute of Health link, and Google tells us the NIH is the primary agency of the United States government responsible for biomedical and public health research. So if we click on this link, we get the link to the good doctor's work. So here's the study that was received for publication in 1945. And so if we scroll down to the bottom to the discussion part, it says, although the detection of polio virus in human blood has not been reported heretofore, nevertheless, the rarity of the event, 1 out of 111, that's less than 1%, is in itself an indication as to its probable lack of importance. In other words, it's unimportant. In other words, it is possible to say that the presence of poliovirus in the bloodstream appears to be neither a common event nor a necessary factor in the pathogenesis of the human disease. So if we look down at the summary and conclusions, it says virus was detected in the blood of one patient, a girl aged 9 years with abortive poliomyelitis, whose blood sample was obtained within 6 hours of onset of illness. What is abortive poliomyelitis? Well, if we scroll up here, it says clinical history of positive case. E. Bunn, a 9-year-old girl living in New Haven, Connecticut, was perfectly well. She was perfectly well until the morning of August 12, 1943. The week of August 12th to 18th marked the peak of the epidemic in New Haven. In other words, there's a bunch of kids are getting paralyzed and dying. They have no idea why, or most people have no clue. Everyone's scared. And so at 11 a.m., while playing outdoors, she was struck on the back of her neck by her brother's fist. She was punched in the neck by her brother. Immediately after this, she went home and complained of her neck hurting badly and pain along the inner aspect of her right thigh. She also complained of feeling chilly and was noted to be feverish. She was admitted to the hospital. Temperature was 38.4 degrees Celsius. She had exhibited stiffness of the back and neck and hamstring muscles, but no weakness or paralysis. The remainder of the physical examination was essentially negative. They took some blood, tested the blood. So the next day, her temperature was 38.2 Celsius. On August 14th, so 2 days later, dropped to normal. No paralysis, no weakness developed, and she was discharged on August 16th. I felt numbness in limbs before. I've been punched in the back of the neck and the spine and the back, and martial arts training or just horsing around. I've been kicked and punched. Does that mean I had abortive poliomyelitis? So identification of poliomyelitis virus in the blood. This is where they're saying, this is how they determined that there was virus in the blood. So they took this girl's blood, who was perfectly fine, released, no paralysis, no weakness. So clinically nothing wrong with her, but they declared it a case of abortive. She had an abortion of her polio. So they took the blood from the girl and they processed it in a lab, and then they injected it intracerebrally into a rhesus monkey. And they did it again 7 days later. On the 16th day, the monkey had a fever of 106 degrees Fahrenheit, complete left facial paralysis, and weakness of the extremities. So what is intracerebral? Situated or occurring within or introduced or administered into the cerebrum. So they put a needle into the monkey's brain. Now if we look up head trauma, facial paralysis, it says, why does head trauma cause facial palsy? Skull fracture is responsible for causing facial palsy. So damage to the head, the brain, the cranium causes facial paralysis. This monkey had damage to the cranium, cerebrum, and had facial paralysis. Facial cerebral paralysis occurs during a stroke or when nerves that control the muscles in the face are damaged in the brain. They go on to say that the weakness appeared to be weaker on the following day when the animal was sacrificed. So then they do a dissection. They find lesions on the spinal cord and the medulla. So how do they determine that this is contagious? Well, they ground up some of this dead monkey parts, and then they injected it into another monkey, and what do you know? That monkey got paralyzed too. So they inject these monkeys in the head, and it causes paralysis. And this is how they determine that it was polio, that there's virus in there. At no time does it say that this girl had her brain drilled and injected stuff in there. None of the other 111 patients does it say that they had their heads drilled, and that's why they got polio or abortive polio. So if we go to the beginning of this paper, it says that these negative findings, in other words, other studies that were done 30 years ago, and so they're considered worth reinvestigating. And again, they make the claim that they got the virus recovered from the blood of monkeys. And how did they determine that the monkeys have virus? So if we go back to Google and search active immunity to poliomyelitis in chimpanzees, we will get another study done by the good Dr. HORSTMANN a year later in 1946. So here, Dr. HORSTMANN voices some of the questions or concerns about this method and what it means and what it actually demonstrates. Putting it into the brain, and says that these portals of entry are not those used by the virus in the natural disease is obvious in the case of the former route and unlikely in the latter instance. So putting it into the brain or injecting it up the nose is not a natural thing. So down here it says criteria for a positive result in which the stool extracts were tested in monkeys or the appearance of myelitis and lesions, and the production of typical paralysis was used to establish a positive test in mice and rats. So in other words, when they get a positive result, it isn't from the monkey that they're feeding this stuff to. They take a stool sample from the monkeys they fed, and then they take that and process it in a lab and inject it into these other monkeys' brains. And this is how they're coming to the conclusion that there's a virus in there. And here at the end of this report, we get the discussion. And it says the evidence of infection being entirely at the subclinical level with the development of a virus carrier state. So in other words, they didn't have any illness, any sickness. Subclinical, according to Webster, subclinical means not detectable, or producing effects that are not detectable by the usual clinical tests. And then the doctor goes on to say, the question may be raised as to whether the type of carrier state described in this report is truly an infection. And these experiments that they did to claim immunity or claim they found the virus, like before they would do the intracerebral injection, and then of course the monkeys would get paralyzed from this. So this time they didn't do that because it is likely that such a vigorous challenge of placing it in intimate contact would break through what they're claiming to be immunity. So they used a more delicate approach in their experiments. In other words, they didn't drill into their brain and inject some stuff straight in there. Summary, this report is concerned with the production of subclinical, in other words, not detectable. They couldn't prove or find any signs of polio in the monkeys, in the test people. And it goes on to say, immunity as defined here. In other words, this report used their own definition of immunity. So if we go back to Google and do another search for polio virus in the blood of orally infected monkeys, we get this 1952 study that they did years later. And it's available behind a paywall. And with this deepdive.com, you can sign up for a free 2-week trial and be able to read this. So in this experiment, the doctor goes on to talk about how they came to the conclusion that these samples that they're taking have virus in them. They're feeding some stuff to these monkeys, and it says 24 hours after feeding, 5 to 10 milliliters of blood is withdrawn from each animal. And then they process that blood in the lab, and then they go to some other monkeys, a different species, and they drill inject it into their brains. And this is how they claim to determine there's a virus. So you take some blood or some poop or whatever out of one monkey, you process it in a lab, then you inject it into the brain of another monkey, and if the monkey has problems or gets paralyzed or dies, then this is what they claim is proof that there was a virus in there. So if we go back to Google and search for extrahuman sources of poliomyelitis virus, we'll get a link to this article. And again, this is behind a paywall and can use Deep Dive and the free trial to read it. This report goes on to talk about all the different ways that they tried to find a virus in these towns that had epidemics. It says here, consequently, it is difficult, if not impossible, in determining the transmission of this disease and to rule out extrahuman factors completely. The observations have emphasized for years of outbreaks that polio is correlated with seasonal influences such as rainfall, temperature, and prevalence of insects and animals. So they did things like they'd go to the site of an outbreak and they'd find some animals. There's one example. It says this guy attempted to recover virus from the poop of dogs and chickens. Results were negative. So they were collecting this stuff, and it says attempts to isolate the virus. Mice were captured in or near the homes of patients in 3 epidemic areas in Michigan, Fort Worth, one animal which appeared to be paralyzed. So nervous tissue and several inches of the lower part of the intestine were ground with alundum and filtered through Mandler candles. So intracerebrally into rhesus monkeys, mice, and rats. So in other words, their definition of proving that there's a virus in this concoction of ground up, diseased, who knows what, is that they inject it into the head of these animals, and if something happens to them, if they get paralyzed or die, this is their proof that this concoction has a virus in it. Even though they don't isolate anything, there's a bunch of other stuff in there. They claim that must be a virus that's causing paralysis and killing these animals, not all the other stuff that's in there. And here's another experiment. It says all specimens fail to transmit infection, with the exception of one pool of brains, cords, and intestines from rats captured at the city dump in Texas. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never ground up some diseased rat parts and injected into my brain, or, hopefully no doctor has ever injected that into any human, definitely not a child. So in other words, they keep saying, they inject these rhesus monkeys and collect, say, the ground up parts from this diseased or dead monkey, and then they try to inject it into another monkey and make them sick. And then he's saying it was unsuccessful. This is how they're defining virus or contagion, by grounding up this stuff and drilling it into the heads of animals. So when I was reading this stuff, somebody sent Dr. Horstmann's work to me, and I was just like, what? How? Grinding stuff up and drilling holes into heads, and that's proof that there's a virus in there? That doing these extreme experiments is proof of a virus? And the proof of, abortive polio? Like where do they get these terms? Just the idea that someone's fine, they're well, they have 0 problems, and they're labeled an abortive, a non-paralytic. Basically saying, oh, you're sick, you just don't have any signs of sickness. How does that make any sense? Someone help me out. Please explain to me how you can be sick and not be sick. Isn't that defy the definition of the word sick or ill? Or if you're unwell, you aren't you supposed to have problems? Something's wrong with you? Otherwise, who complains, oh, I feel great today, I better go to the doctor and make sure I'm not sick. I've never said that in my life. At least this Dr. Horstmann had the integrity to write in there her doubts and her, the questions that someone might have reading her work and going, what does this prove? How is this isolating anything? And we're putting all this stuff into injecting it into heads and into spines and into, and just injecting it, period. None of the kids that got sick got injected with anything. They were out playing in the summertime, eating fruits and whatnot, or, FDR was swimming in some water. They say he got polio. Nobody injected anything into his brain that I know of. And where's the logic? The more I dug into this, the more I just was like, it's hard to believe that this is what's considered evidence, that there's a virus, and that I can't explain it. I can't make any sense of it. Like, where's the real world experiment where you put someone next to someone and then they get polio? And then the person next to them gets polio, and you've ruled out, how about an elimination diet or elimination terrain environment where all the possibility, all the toxins, whatever, are ruled out. All the chemicals gone, all the sanitation problems, poor health. We remove all those and just see, okay, is everybody well? Is anybody getting sick? No, everybody's well, they're good. Okay, let's reintroduce the insecticides, see if anybody gets sick. Okay, oh shit, everybody's getting paralyzed and dying. Maybe it's the insecticides, you know? Or if you put the insecticides in and nobody gets sick and people are eating fruit covered in that stuff and nothing happens to them, then we know that it's not the insecticides. We can rule that out and then keep looking for what is the cause, you know? That seems pretty simple and basic to me. Like, why hasn't that been done? Why are they doing all these experiments by grinding up monkey parts and doing all, you know, this one report read like a house of horrors. It was just awful, all these experiments they did to monkeys. You know, it's like Dr. Cowan says, you know, if you want to find out about something, the first step isn't killing it. You know, you look at something alive and start asking questions. Mind-boggling. You know, so I hope this helps. And, you know, if you like, share, spread it around, comment, come on over to my website, or let's check the links below and donate. And you know, let's get to the truth of this. Let's find out what's going on. Let's take care of each other, come back together and actually build healthy communities and do what works, what's proven. You know, let's find out for sure and welcome everybody's voice, so that maybe some crackpot out there can speak and maybe they know the answer. Maybe they're not such a crackpot. Maybe, you know, 1 out of 1,000 of their net ideas is actually true. But the only way to find out is to let everybody speak. And then if we don't like what they're saying, we don't have to listen. You know, move on to the next person. And, you know, at least then we find out, you know, instead of wondering, never knowing. So thanks. Hope this helps.